This happened in July of last year. My house was having some pretty big problems, and I was left without any power for several days while it was getting repaired. I work from home, so this was a major issue, and I ultimately had to rent an Airbnb to stay at for a few days until the power was back on in my home. I don't live in the biggest city, so there weren't many options for Airbnbs near me. The closest one at a reasonable price was about a 45-minute drive from my home. It was in an even smaller and more secluded area of the city, often referred to as not the best section to live in. I was only staying for a few days though, so the amount I was saving was worth it. When I arrived, I went right inside and basically straight to bed, exhausted from everything going on with my house. In the morning, I got up early and started setting up my laptop and workspace. Just before I had to start work, there was a knock at the door. I debated whether or not to open it because it wasn't even my house, but thinking it might be the host or something, I went up and checked who it was. On the porch stood a man, maybe in his early 30s, covered in tattoos. He didn't look like an Airbnb host or even a salesperson. Unsure why he was there and not really wanting to know, I figured I'd leave it. I walked away from the door and went back to the desk, finishing getting ready and starting work. I had some meetings and a lot of work to catch up on from my absence the last few days. I don't think I left the desk until 8 p.m., and even then, I was considering going back to work after going out to pick up dinner. Only a couple of minutes after I got back and started eating, another knock came at the door. I immediately got up and went to check who it was, and I wasn't surprised to see it was that same guy from before. What could he possibly want from me this late in the day? I was actually more bothered than concerned, but again, I just walked away from the door and went back to eat my dinner. After 30 minutes and around 1 p.m., I decided to work for at least another hour. I was tired, but the work had to get done, and I knew putting it off until tomorrow would just make me more stressed. I put my headphones in and tried to focus for the next hour. I got a lot done, and once I was satisfied, I finally closed my laptop for the night. I hadn't realized how dark it had gotten. I guess my laptop screen was the only light I had on. I went to the front to flick on the light, and a chill instantly rushed through me. Going down the front hallway were faint but unmistakable shoe prints. Looking around, they were all over the place, even going right up behind the desk I was working at. Terrified, I slowly followed them down to the back door, which was cracked open. I don't even know how to describe what I was feeling. It was just pure horror. Only moments after, footsteps started coming down the stairs. They were slow and careful, but when they got to the bottom, a man peered out into the hallway and looked directly at me. It was that same man, easily distinguishable with all the tattoos, and he looked surprised to see me walking around. But that surprise quickly turned into rage. His face had no emotions other than irritation and anger. I was going to try to say something, but no words came out, and as my heart started pounding in my chest, I turned right back around and sprinted out the back door. I ran through the backyard and into some trees far behind the houses. I sat behind a tree and pulled out my phone, starting to dial 911, but quickly closed it when I heard footsteps running toward me. I didn't expect them to follow me, but luckily they passed by without seeing me and continued to run out into the dark. Once I got in contact with the police, I went back to the Airbnb and waited for them. I gave a detailed description of the man, and they actually found him the next day. It was confirmed to be him by the tattoos I had noticed, and he'd actually broken into several homes in the days leading up, doing horrible things to those who lived in them. I don't know what he was planning to do to me or why he seemed to have left me alone at first, but I can rest easy knowing he won't be able to do anything anymore. I was driving across the country for a kind of hectic trip. I had to get some things done for work at an office way up in Maine, and decided that while I was there, already on the road trip, I'd visit some friends and family on the East Coast. During my fourth day of driving, I was spending most of that day going through Pennsylvania. There were a lot of cool towns, but most of the drive was through nothing. And to get where I was going, it took me on a lot of side routes, which were these long and empty one-lane highways. As it was getting late, rain started coming down and my fuel was running low. I hadn't passed any gas stations in a while, so I figured there had to be one soon. But again, this road wasn't really going through any towns. I continued through the rain for another 30 minutes, and barely through the fog, I saw a sign for a gas station, and a couple of moments later, it showed up ahead of me. It was off the side of the road, nestled in the trees, and was really small. It only had 2 pumps and a tiny concession building behind it. Having no other choice, I pulled in and parked, getting out and opening up my gas tank. When I pulled the pump off and tried to insert my card, it didn't work. I wiped the dusty screen and tried to see what it was saying, but it didn't say anything. It wasn't even on. I then went over to the only other pump, and it was also off. Frustrated, I looked around. With it raining and being well past sunset, it was really hard to make anything out. Sure, the place looked old and outdated, but so did a lot of other gas stations. After a closer look, though, I noticed a small light inside the concession building. Hoping it was a worker who could help me, I stepped out from under the overhang covering the pumps and ran up to the door. Moisture was covering the entire glass door, so I couldn't see inside. All I could see was the light reflecting through the glass. I grabbed the handle, and it screeched open. When I stepped inside, I immediately knew something was wrong. The store shelves were empty, and some were even knocked over. The place just looked like it was destroyed. The light was coming from somewhere in the back and was now clearly some sort of lamp or something. Definitely not a regular store light. I was only in there for a few seconds, and after seeing all of that, I quickly stepped back outside. I didn't know what was going on in there, but I knew it couldn't be anything good and definitely not helpful for my situation. As I backed out of the store and into the rain, I turned around toward my car, but a person was standing next to it. They were completely drenched in water and were just looking around my car and into the windows. "Hey, what are you doing?" I yelled as I quickly made my way up to them. They shot a look at me, then moved their eyes behind me. I turned back to look at the building. The front door was open, and a man came out into the rain. He had long black hair and a sickly look. He spent no time assessing the situation and instantly started running at me. The other person by my car just backed away as I got inside, but the man running didn't slow down. He came right up to my door and tried opening it, and as I pulled away, a loud metallic scrape vibrated through the car. I sped out of there and back onto the road, making it another half hour before my car ran out of gas. Luckily, I had cell service in the area and was able to get help. While I waited, I looked at the outside of my car and saw a huge line going across the door. It looked like the man had run a knife along it when I drove away. Police informed me later that night that the gas station I was at was not in service for at least a decade. Other than that, though, nothing else came of it, and what would have happened if I didn't get out in time is left to nothing but theories. This was about 10 months ago now. I was spending a few days with my best friend from college in his hometown. I'll call him Chris for privacy. It was a really small town compared to what I was used to, but Chris was showing me around, and we went to the bars, just hanging out and having a good time. On my last night there, he mentioned a place he'd been wanting to explore for a while, but hadn't had anyone to go with. It was some abandoned house or town he knew of a few miles out in the woods. We used to go exploring and backpacking all the time in college, so it sounded like a pretty cool idea. Only 30 minutes after hearing about it, we were already trekking through a path in the woods. We still had some sunlight left, but brought headlamps just in case. After about 20 minutes of walking, the trail ended, and we had to follow a very faint footpath through the trees. It went on for another hour before we made it. We could see a house in the distance, and as we got closer, we saw several more behind it. It wasn't what either of us expected, though. The houses didn't really look that old. They looked weathered and heavily damaged, but they had modern siding and things like that, making them look kind of like any other house. There was even a tiny gravel road leading from each of the homes. It looked like maybe they were trying to build a community, and something went wrong, causing them to abandon it. Other people had been there before us, though. evident by the graffiti on the sides of the houses. Chris and I went up to the first house, looking through the open doorway. There were weeds growing through the floorboards, but it was otherwise empty. Before we stepped in, though, a loud slamming sound echoed through the woods. Both of us jumped and stared down the gravel road, where we thought it came from. After that sound, though, it was quiet. We had no idea what it was, but after seeing nothing, we went inside the house. There wasn't too much to look at, but what made it interesting was trying to figure out why anyone would abandon it. The house looked like it would have been nice before it was left behind. After walking around the first floor, we went upstairs to the second. Oddly, it got way darker upstairs, like no windows were letting in any light. The hallway was short, with only 2 doors and what looked like an attic in the ceiling. We went up to the first door and opened it, seeing another empty room, but we were quickly interrupted by hearing something downstairs. There were shuffling footsteps coming through the grass and up to the house we were in. We stayed quiet, but we were sure that whoever they were had probably seen us outside. But why would they try to approach us? They walked up to the front doorway, then stopped just before they entered. Hello? We didn't respond. I just want to talk. No harm at all. He sounded older, almost like he was missing teeth or something, stumbling a bit over his words. After that, though, there was a whole minute of silence. He didn't say anything else, but we didn't hear him leave either. We waited another few minutes, still not hearing anything, before Chris quietly went down the staircase and looked over at the front door. He turned and looked back at me with a pale face. There was nobody there. I quickly went to see for myself, but he wasn't lying. There was nobody in the doorway. We carefully made our way down and over to the doorway, looking out. There was one line of footprints in the grass coming from where the other houses were, but no footprints leaving. Both of us figured it out at the same time and bolted for the trees, knowing the guy must have been hiding inside the house somehow. We got out of the woods as fast as we could and went back to his place. Who that guy was and why he wanted to talk to us, we don't know. I'm sure if he'd found us, though, we probably wouldn't be here. I was backpacking through a route I'd found in the Cascades National Park. It was an out-and-back trail that typically takes 3 days one way and 3 days back. I didn't know too much about it or how popular the trail was, but on long backpacking routes like this, it usually doesn't matter, as you'll most likely not run into many people anyway. On my 3rd day out, though, I passed by one of the campsites and saw a man sitting by his tent. I took a break and we talked for a bit. He mentioned he was staying there for the night and heading to the peak of the trail the following day. I told him that was where I was heading today and that I'd probably see him when he got there. I left shortly after and got to what would be my campsite for the next 2 nights. The view was something I'd never experienced before, and it made for a great rest day at the peak of the trail. That whole day, nobody passed through, and when it came to night, I was still the only one camping there. I thought back to that guy I'd met at the campsite a day behind me who said he'd be reaching this trail peak on this day. He never showed up, though. I thought he maybe decided to turn around for some reason or just camp out for another day at the place he was already at. In the morning, I packed up and started back down the way I came, though I got a late start, so at the very least, I was hoping to make it to that same campsite where the man was at. I was really sore for some reason too, which didn't help, and before I knew it, there was almost no daylight left. I put on my headlamp and continued on the trail, walking for another hour past sundown before I made it to the camp. The tent that the man had was still there, set up like he never left. Knowing his plans to continue hiking, and just knowing that staying at one camp for several days while backpacking is unusual, I called out, asking if he was okay. There was no response. I walked up a bit closer and said I just wanted to check in on him, but the flap on his tent was partially open and nobody was inside. I felt a lump in my throat, like my body knew something wasn't right. I stood and looked all around, not seeing a single sign of him anywhere until I saw a glimmer in the distance. There was a faint light sitting still far out in the woods. I began walking up to it, going about 40 yards from the tents before I found the source, It was a headlamp laying on the ground, like it had been accidentally left behind, and the light was so dim that it must have been nearly out of batteries. And it was just then that I noticed someone watching me. They were standing not too far, just 10 yards away, clearly trying not to be seen. I knew in my gut that this wasn't the man from before, but I felt like I had to say or do something. "Hello, do you need help?" They stood still and quiet. "I'm sorry, I'll leave," I said shakily, then hurried back to the tent. Luckily, I hadn't unpacked anything yet, so I put my backpack on and started walking out of the campsite. As I did, the headlamp in the woods turned off. I got away and walked as far as I could, going another 3 miles to the next camp. I reported as soon as I could as well, and unfortunately, it was just what I thought. It was the man that I had met, and he was missing. There were almost no traces for them to follow, and out in the backcountry, it's nearly impossible to search for anyone. Who that person I saw out there was is likely the biggest unknown that could give us answers as to what happened, though it seems like most of us are aware of the most probable scenario that took place. I had booked an Airbnb several weeks in advance in a town I'd never been to before. A client I was meeting for work lived in the area, so I was only staying there for a day and then driving back home afterward. The drive was 3 hours, and when I pulled into the driveway and got out, the neighborhood it was in was very quiet. Most of the house lights were off, and trees covered the lawns, blocking out most of the view. The only thing I really saw was a person walking down the road. They were far down, and nothing really looked off about it, but for some reason, it just gave me a strange feeling. I went up and unlocked the door, going inside and situating myself. It was a very average house. Nothing really special about it, but it was great for what I needed it for. After making my rounds and checking the place out, I opened the front door to get my other bag from my car. As I stepped onto the porch, though, I noticed someone standing in the road. It was the person I'd seen walking a few minutes ago, but they weren't walking anymore. They were just standing in the road and facing the Airbnb. As I started walking toward my car, they noticed me and started walking away. I kept my eye on them while I was out there, getting suspicious about whatever that was. They seemed to just keep walking, though, continuing down the street. I went back inside and made sure it was all locked up, then opened the garage and pulled my car in, just to be safe. Throughout the next couple of hours, I did a few checks outside to see if that guy was still walking around. I didn't see him anymore, though, and since I had to get up early the next morning, I went to bed. I slept decently, waking up a few times during the night, but my alarm went off at 4 a.m. for me to finally get up. The sun was still down, so it was still dark outside, but I groggily sat up in my bed, and right away, I saw a light coming from under the bedroom door. I didn't remember leaving any lights on, though. I thought I must have somehow overlooked a kitchen light or something. I got out of bed and walked up to the door, but just before I opened it, I heard something on the other side. It sounded like something moving around at the end of the hallway. I opened the door, seeing it was the living room light that was on, which I immediately knew I definitely would have turned off. The sound continued, though, as I walked down the hallway and looked into the living room. A guy was in the corner, searching through one of my bags. He had a black hoodie and ripped up jeans, which was exactly what the person I saw walking around was wearing. I only looked at him for a second before he turned around and faced me. He didn't look startled at all. It was almost like he was expecting me. He dropped the bag on the ground and yelled at me to stay where I was. He began making his way over, and I only had a split second to decide what to do. I turned and ran back to the room, slamming the door shut just before he caught up to me. He rammed into it and tried to kick the door down, then started messing with the lock on the other side. I thought quickly and opened a window, jumping out and running away. By the time I was able to get police there, the man wasn't in the house anymore. My bags were gone too, of course, and to make things more terrifying, the bedroom door was open. He had picked the lock and gotten in, so if I had just stayed and hidden in the bathroom or something, who knows what would have happened. Police seemed to think there was more intent behind this man's actions aside from just robbing me, so I pray he doesn't find me again. Earlier this spring, I was camping in the woods 4 hours north of where I live. There was a small lake that I'd go to a lot. It was never crowded or even really known about, I don't think, so it made for a nice peaceful getaway every time I went. When I got there on the first day and set everything up, nobody else was there. The lake wasn't too big and was surrounded by a grassy beach with the woods around it, so I could see pretty much all around the lake. Not too long after I arrived, I saw a man come out of the woods on the other side and set up a tent. He looked like an average camper and was keeping to himself for the first little while. Before sundown, though, I saw him making his way around the lake and over toward my campsite. He had a friendly smile and introduced himself as William. He said he wasn't sure if I saw him set up camp or not, but he saw me across the lake and just wanted to say hi, since we were both out in the middle of nowhere at a lake that nobody usually comes to. We talked for a while, and he was really cool, actually. William was 26, which was around the same age as me, and we both liked this camping spot because of how secluded it was. After talking for 30 minutes, he went back to the other side of the lake as the sun was coming down. Not much else happened that night, but in the morning, we ended up talking and hanging out for most of the day. He shared a 6-pack of beers with me, and we sat on the beach and had some good, casual conversations. When we went back to our tents at the end of the day, I was sitting by my small campfire and was really happy I'd met William. He seemed like the perfect buddy to go camping with, maybe some other time. As it got later, though, I started getting ready to stomp out the fire and go to bed when I saw William walking around the lake. His campfire had gone out a while ago, so I thought he was in his tent already sleeping, but apparently not. He walked up to my campfire, and right away, something was different about him. "Hey, everything good, man?" I said. He smiled and was suddenly back to how he was before, but he said he came over to ask if I wanted to see a cool spot he found that had a great view. I said it was kind of late to be going out, but he assured me that the view was great because it was dark out. The way he was hyping it up made me feel like I couldn't not see it, and what would be the point of camping out in the woods if I just passed up the good views? I got up and followed him to the other side of the lake, then trailed behind him as he led us through the woods. There was no path or anything, so I pretty quickly knew that whatever spot this was, William had to have been there many times before to know the exact way without getting lost, especially out in the dark. We walked for maybe 15 minutes before William started slowing down. He pointed ahead and smiled like this was the view, but when I walked in front of him and looked out, there was a small structure. It was an old RV or camper that looked like it had been abandoned and succumbed to the elements for years. Moss grew all over it, and holes of rust covered the siding. I turned back to look at William, wondering what this was, but his face was now cold and empty. He looked like he was a different person. "William, what is this?" He didn't answer. Feeling a rush of fear, I started frantically looking around, and that's when I heard the rusty metal door swing open behind me. I only saw for a quick second as someone else came running out before I started sprinting away. I could hear both William and the other person following close behind, but I gave my every strength to keep going until I lost them. By then, I'd run so far into the woods that I had no idea where I was. I just kept walking and keeping my eyes on the trees until the sun came up. By the time I found my way back to the lake, I saw from the tree line that all of my camping gear was gone. It looked as if I was never even there. I stayed hidden and got back on the trail, making it back to my car. I made a report with the local police, but they never mentioned finding anything. I don't think they even really looked, to be honest. What was planned for me that night is horrifying to think about, but at least I got out before having to witness it firsthand. I was on a road trip from Portland to Chicago. It's nearly a 3-day drive, so I had some places booked to sleep at along the route. I didn't get too particular with what places I chose, but I went with Airbnb so I could at least enjoy the road trip a bit more rather than staying in a crowded hotel. My first Airbnb was in Wyoming, and the route through the state doesn't pass through any big cities really, so it was in a very small town. It was probably no bigger than 2 or 3 miles long. As I passed the border into Wyoming, it started snowing heavily, which only dragged on the long day of driving. By the time I got into town, the roads were covered in snow, and the sun had already set. It was pretty dead. I mean, I don't know much about small towns, but this seemed exactly how I thought it would be, especially in a low population state like Wyoming. I was hoping there would be a McDonald's or something that I could get a quick dinner from, but it was very clear that there wasn't going to be. So I drove through the town and turned down the road to my Airbnb. It was a long driveway leading up to a small home in the middle of a field, with tall, snow-covered pine trees lined up in the front yard. I parked on the side and got out with my bag, then walked around to the front. I put in the code and got inside, closing the door behind me and turning on the lights. It was small, probably 500 square feet, with just a living room and a bedroom. I took my shoes off and dropped my bag next to the bed, then sat on the couch. When I did, a thump came from the bedroom. I looked back at the doorway I had just come from. It was pretty loud, but I had no idea what it could have been. I got up and walked back, looking into the room and turning on the light. Everything was the same. I went and checked the small bathroom that was in there as well. But it all looked good, and the only other door in the house was the bedroom closet. I walked over and tugged on the door handle, but it didn't budge. It seemed like it was locked from the other side. At first, I was pretty weirded out that a bedroom closet would be kept shut. But then I thought it could have been a maintenance closet the owner was using to store stuff. There were no other places to put anything, so that was the final conclusion I came to. I went back to the living room and rested my eyes on the couch while thinking through my plan for the next day. After about 15 minutes, I got up and went over to the window, looking out to see if the snow was still coming down and if the roads were even going to be drivable tomorrow. It was eerily dark outside, with no lights from the town showing behind the tall pine trees, and it was still snowing heavily. I shut the blinds and turned back to the couch, but I saw a shadow move in the bedroom. It was slow and smooth, like the shadow of a door opening or closing. I started walking over, listening as I approached the doorway and looked inside the room. Everything was in place, and nothing looked to have caused the shadow I saw, but I knew I saw something moving there. I continued looking around until my eyes fell back on the closet. It was still closed, but something gave me an unsettling feeling about it. I stepped up and grabbed the handle, and it opened with ease. It wasn't locked anymore, but inside there wasn't anything. It was just a small, empty walk-in closet. Before I could fully process everything and try to put the pieces together, I heard someone behind me. When I turned around, a large man was standing in the doorway to the bathroom. He looked beaten and tired, with scratches and cuts all over his face. As I stared at him, he didn't even seem to care. He stepped into the bedroom and knelt down, grabbing a dirty and worn duffel bag from under the bed. The man then stood back up and didn't even look at me as he slowly walked out of the room and out the front door. I ran up and saw him trailing through the snow until he was beyond the lights from the house. I tried to get the police involved, but after giving my description, they really only talked to the Airbnb host. After leaving town, I didn't get any more information. I think it's most likely that he was just using the place to sleep or something, but the way he looked makes me second guess that. I just can't even think of what could have happened if I went right to bed that night, with the man hiding in the closet just inches away from me. This was a few months ago while driving for DoorDash. I only drive as a side gig, maybe 10 to 15 hours a week. This night, I was only doing a couple of orders since it was already late, and I had picked up a small order around 1 a.m. It was to be delivered to a business building somewhere across town, which was apparent by the address. This was a normal thing, usually for overnight workers or whatever. When I pulled into the parking lot, though, it was empty, no cars at all, and it didn't look like there was a parking lot behind the building either. I parked in a spot near the front and got out with the food. The place was definitely an office building of some kind, and it was smaller than most, being only 2 stories and not very wide. All the lights were off in the windows, except for one light behind the front door. I walked up to the door and checked the app, seeing it had specific drop-off instructions to enter the main hallway and leave the bag outside of room 232. I looked through the door into the building, seeing a hallway with a bunch of closed doors on either side. Delivering to specific rooms was something I'd only done at hotels, so this was kind of new for me. I tested the door, pushing on it, and it was unlocked, so I stepped inside. I expected to hear people working, moving around, or talking, but instead, I didn't hear anything. There wasn't a single sound in the whole building. It was just white noise from the overhead lights buzzing above me. As I passed the first few doors, they were all numbered in the 100s, like 12 and 106. The room the instructions said to leave it at was in the 200s, so I assumed that meant it was on the second floor. In the middle of the hallway was the doorway leading to the staircase. It was held open with a wedge door stopper on the floor, but the lights weren't on. I stepped in and up to the bottom of the staircase, then looked up. The whole stairwell was pitch black. Not even any light was coming from above, where the room was supposed to be for me to drop it off at. Again, I started to notice the eerie silence, and it sent a chill through me. I was always one to do whatever the instructions say, so I'd get good reviews. Chitty, but this was the first time I told myself that this was too sketchy. I stepped out of the stairwell and back into the hallway, and just as I did, the door right across from me opened. The lights in that room were off, but a man emerged from behind the door and stepped into the hallway. He was wearing street clothes and didn't look like an office worker at all, but he stood in front of me and pointed past me at the stairwell. Room 232 is up there. I nodded but didn't move, and neither did he. He just looked me in the eyes with a look like he was suppressing his anger. After an intense few seconds, I dropped the bag on the ground and started quickly walking to the exit. The man didn't follow me, but I heard his footsteps go into the stairwell and up the stairs as I left the building. I got in my car and left. I didn't know what that was or if I was maybe overreacting about it, so I didn't call the police. The following day, though, the police actually called me. Apparently, the office reported a break-in, and in the CCTV footage, they saw my car and license plate, tracking it back to me. They also had footage of the break-in, so they called me in to question me about any information I might have. I didn't have much to give, but it turned out there were actually 3 people that broke inside. One was downstairs, who I saw, but the other 2 were shown on the cameras to be hiding at the top of the stairs, seemingly waiting for me to go up. Disturbingly, several other delivery orders were made to that same office that night. All of the other drivers were smarter than I was, though, leaving the orders outside by the front door. What would have taken place in that office had any of us gone up to the second floor is unknown, but hopefully, police can find the 3 men before anyone falls victim to it. My wife and I take yearly vacations to different places. It's our way of taking a break from everyday life and getting to spend some quality time together. This year, we had a cabin booked in Washington State. It was far out and described online as being quiet and peaceful, away from any other places or people. Most of our life is in crowded cities, so this sounded great for us. When we flew in, we walked to a grocery store to pick up what we needed, then took a taxi out to the cabin. We didn't need a car because we knew we'd only be there for 3 days, and we wanted to just spend it at the cabin. If we changed our minds or needed anything else, we could always just order an Uber. The taxi ride was just over an hour from the town we landed in. Most of the drive was between huge mountain ranges and tree-covered landscapes. It was really beautiful and got us both excited for our stay. Then, at just about 7 p.m., we arrived at the cabin. It was completely alone in the middle of the forest. Even the driveway leading to it wasn't much more than some tire tracks in the dirt. We got out, paid the taxi, and brought our stuff inside. The cabin itself was small. There was the main floor that had the kitchen and living room, with a ladder leading up to a loft area that had the bed in it. The bed area in the loft was short. You literally had to crawl into the bed, kind of like one you'd see in a tiny home. Anyway, we unpacked the groceries and made a very quick dinner since we were tired from the flight, then opened a bottle of wine to settle in for the night. We lit up the fireplace and chatted about how we were looking forward to the next few days. It was around 11 p.m. at this point, and as we talked, we both suddenly heard something outside. Someone was walking in the grass near the cabin. It was loud too, like they were really close. My wife looked nervous, so I tried to put on a brave face and told her it was fine. I got up and looked out the window. It wasn't until then that I realized how dark it had gotten outside. I looked around, seeing nothing but large trees everywhere and pitch black darkness around them. I told her I didn't see anyone, then went over to the front door and opened it, stepping onto the porch and turning on the outdoor lights. All I could really see out there was a small portion of the driveway, but I didn't see anyone there either. The forest was very calm and quiet, so if they were still walking around, I felt like I would have been able to hear them. I went back inside and asked my wife if she heard the footsteps anymore, but she said the sound didn't seem to fade out. It just stopped suddenly from somewhere behind the cabin. My brave act was starting to fall through, and I told her to go up to the loft and stay quiet while I figured out what was going on. I went around and checked all the windows again, not seeing anything, so I went back to the front door. I was preparing myself to go back outside when a sudden thump shook the cabin. I looked up at my wife, who was looking at the ceiling. Someone was on the roof of the cabin. I stayed inside and called the police, going over lengthy directions on how to get to the cabin we were at. Over the course of the hour that we had to wait, we could occasionally hear a few footsteps walking across the top of the cabin. About 45 minutes into the wait, we heard their boots hit the ground, followed by them calmly walking away. I looked out the window once more, seeing their outline disappearing into the forest. Police took our report and gave us a ride into town, where we spent the rest of our vacation. What that person was doing miles away from civilization in the middle of a forest is terrifying, seeing as they were likely waiting for us to either go to bed or go outside. We're just thankful that we got out of there before something else could have happened. I've owned and lived in the same house for 8 years. It's a normal family-sized home, which was relevant when I had roommates, but when they moved out, it just became me living here. I had nothing to do with the extra space. It was technically a 4-bedroom house, but I only used 2 of the bedrooms, one as my main bedroom and one as a gaming room. The other 2 rooms were on the far end of the upstairs hallway. One had a few storage boxes in it, and the other was completely empty. After getting out of work at 9, I picked up Wendy's on the way home and pretty much went right to the game room. I was off tomorrow, so what better to do than game all night? I put my headphones on and loaded up COD, but before I had time to even load into a match, I thought I heard something that sounded like a knock at the front door. I took my headset off and listened, but not hearing anything, and figuring they would have knocked again if there was someone there, I went back to my game. Probably a whole 2 hours went by, and then I heard it again. It sounded like either a knock or a door closing, but with my headphones on and my room door closed, it was way too quiet for me to tell. I got up and opened the door, looking out into the hallway and waiting for that sound to come again. After a minute though, I went downstairs and looked out the front door. Nobody was outside my house, and everything seemed normal. Having heard these sounds though, I obviously made sure the door was locked before going back upstairs. To be a bit more cautious, I left my room door open this time, so if it happened again, maybe I'd hear it better. I put my headset back on and continued gaming. I played through a whole round, which was like 20 minutes. As the game ended, and I leaned back in my chair, a figure rushed past the open doorway, just off to the side of my view. I immediately threw my headphones off and jumped from my chair, horrified and unsure what to do. I just stared at the doorway. I didn't get the courage to finally move for several minutes. When I looked into the hallway and eventually the rest of the house, nobody was there, but the front door was unlocked again. When police came and investigated, it was clear that the person had been hiding and very likely living in the empty room. I hadn't been in there for weeks or maybe even months, so all this time, they could have been just on the other side of the wall from me, and I had no idea. It's really scary to think about, especially if I'd happened to confront him. There's no saying what he would have done. When I was 19, I worked as an Uber driver. I hadn't figured out quite what I wanted to do with my life yet, so I hadn't started college or anything. I was just doing Uber to pay my bills until I could figure it all out. This night, I was driving from 7 p.m. to 3 a.m., or that was what I was planning to do. Most other drivers weren't working around those times, and I was always more of a night person, so this was just when I liked to work. Around 11, I picked up a lady from a bar and drove 35 minutes away to drop her off at home. It was pretty much at the edge of the city in a much more secluded, quiet area. After that, another pickup request came through from somewhere 10 minutes away. I was reluctant to accept it because the drop-off location wasn't back toward the city, but instead further out. I still ended up accepting it and just hoped that the next person would be going towards the city, where there would likely be more work. I pulled onto the road and started driving to the pickup spot. The road to get there was through a bunch of farmland and not much else. It was pretty empty of any other cars, too. Once I got to the last turn, it was down a thin dirt road going between a field of tall grass or wheat. At the end, I could see a farmhouse on top of a small hill. That was the location that the app said they were at. I pulled up and parked in the open grass just in front of the house. The lights were off, and nobody was outside. After a few seconds, I lightly honked to let them know I was there. I had my windows rolled down, and the crops blowing around in the wind were really loud. I only say that because a sudden tap on the passenger door startled me. I hadn't thought to look back at the road I just came from because I obviously assumed he would be coming from the house. The man leaned his head through the open window and looked at me. There was a strange moment as he held a straight face and said nothing before I spoke, asking if he was the one who ordered the Uber. His eyes moved to the back seat, looking around, before he nodded and looked back at me. "Can you help me carry something out to the car?" Technically being at work, my reactive answer was sure, and I assumed it was just some luggage or something. But I quickly regretted answering without thinking about it. He began walking toward the house, so I got out of the car and followed loosely behind him. Once he got up to the porch, he opened the door and somewhat rushed inside without even looking back at me. As I matched his pace and got onto the porch, the wide open door showed an empty hallway with still no lights turned on, and the man was nowhere to be seen. I couldn't even hear any footsteps of him walking around. Standing there, an eerie feeling loomed over me. "Sir?" I called out. The house remained quiet with no response or movement from inside. Past the doorway, it quickly fell to nearly pitch black, and with it being so eerily quiet, there was no way I was going in there. I turned and ran back to my car, then drove back through the field and down to the main road, canceling the Uber. My biggest regret from that night was not saying anything. I thought since nothing happened, I had no good reason to notify the police. But every time I think back on it, there seems to be less of a chance that it wasn't something horrible. I even looked up some information on the farmhouse about a month after this happened, and all I could find was that it was last sold in the 1960s. So, the man I saw almost definitely wasn't the owner. He probably didn't even live there. What was waiting for me inside that house, had I followed him in, is something I'll never know for sure. This happened to me just a bit over a year ago. I'm 24 and have a townhouse in the suburbs. I live alone, which for me gets really boring, so I try to have friends over whenever I can. My closest friends come over a couple of times a week, and sometimes even sleep over to escape their parents' houses. I didn't have any plans this night, but I had plans for the next day with my friend Sarah, who was supposed to be coming over for a movie night, so I was really just trying to get this night over with and looking forward to the next day. I went to bed early, like around 9:15 p.m. In the middle of the night, I woke up. I looked at my nightstand and saw it was 2 a.m., but the way I woke up was odd. My heart was pounding for some reason, and my brain was very alert, like something was happening. I thought maybe I had just woken up from a nightmare or something, until I heard a click from downstairs. I sat up, A door slowly screeched open, and I could hear someone's footsteps entering my home. Although terrified, I thought this had to be Sarah or one of my other friends, as they all had keys to my house in case they needed somewhere to stay. I got up from my bed and walked over to the door, opening it and stepping into the hallway. "Sarah?" No one responded. I waited in the hallway for what felt like forever, but then a bright light suddenly flickered on, lighting up the whole downstairs. A second later, a soft chattering noise came from the living room. Whoever it was had turned on the TV. For a moment, I felt relief, thinking it was definitely one of my friends who had had one too many drinks. I went down the stairs and into the living room and felt my whole body turn ice cold in an instant. Some random man was sitting on my couch, looking at the TV screen. He looked maybe 50 years old, with patchy long black hair and dirty clothes. As I stared at him in fear, he glanced over at me and showed a crooked smile, then waved his hand as if to invite me over to the couch. I turned around and sprinted right out the front door. I banged on my neighbor's door until they let me in and called the police. By the time they made it, though, he was gone. No trace of him at all. What's worse is the police didn't take it all that seriously, suggesting it was probably just some harmless homeless man wanting a place to sleep. The way I see it, everything points to otherwise. He picked the lock on my door, sat on my couch, and turned on the TV. Then, the sick man smiled at me and invited me over to the couch. I think he may have been a stalker or something. And now I find it hard to even sleep at night when I'm alone, thinking that there's a chance that I'm not really alone. Earlier this spring, I was camping in the woods 4 hours north of where I live. There was a small lake that I'd go to a lot. It was never crowded or even really known about, so it made for a nice, peaceful getaway every time I went. When I got there on the first day and set everything up, nobody else was there. The lake wasn't too big and was surrounded by a grassy beach with woods around it, so I could see pretty much all around the lake. Not too long after I arrived, I saw a man come out of the woods on the other side and set up a tent. He looked like an average camper and was keeping to himself for the first little while. Before sundown, though, I saw him making his way around the lake and over toward my campsite. He had a friendly smile and introduced himself as William. He said he wasn't sure if I saw him set up camp or not, but he saw me across the lake and just wanted to say hi, since we were both out in the middle of nowhere at a lake that nobody usually comes to. We talked for a while, and he was really cool, actually. William was around 26, which was about the same age as me, and we both liked this camping spot because of how secluded it was. After talking for about 30 minutes, he went back to the other side of the lake as the sun was going down. Not much else happened that night, but in the morning, we ended up talking and hanging out for most of the day. He shared a 6-pack of beers with me, and we sat on the beach and had some good casual conversations. When we went back to our tents at the end of the day, I was sitting by my small campfire, really happy I'd met William. He seemed like the perfect buddy to go camping with, maybe some other time. As it got later, though, I started getting ready to stomp out the fire and go to bed when I saw William walking around the lake. His campfire had gone out a while ago, so I thought he was in his tent already sleeping, but apparently not. He walked up to my campfire, and right away, something was different about him. "Hey, everything good, man?" I asked. He smiled and was suddenly back to how he was before, but he said he came over to ask if I wanted to see a cool spot he found that had a great view. I said it was kind of late to be going out, but he assured me that the view was great because it was dark out. The way he was hyping it up made me feel like I could not see it. And what would be the point of camping out in the woods if I just passed up the good views? I got up and followed him to the other side of the lake, then trailed behind him as he led us through the woods. There was no path or anything, so I pretty quickly knew that whatever spot this was, William had to have been there many times before to know the exact way without getting lost, especially out in the dark. We walked for maybe 15 minutes before William started slowing down. He pointed ahead and smiled like this was the view. But when I walked in front of him and looked out, there was a small structure. It was an old RV or camper that looked like it had been abandoned and succumbed to the elements for years. Moss grew all over it, and holes of rust covered the siding. I turned back to look at William, wondering what this was, but his face was now cold and empty. He looked like he was a different person. "William, what is this?" He didn't answer. Feeling a rush of fear, I started frantically looking around, and that's when I heard the rusty metal door swing open behind me. I only saw for a quick second as someone else came running out before I started sprinting away. I could hear both William and the other person following close behind, but I gave it my every strength to keep going until I lost them. By then, I'd run so far into the woods that I had no idea where I was. I just kept walking, keeping my eyes on the trees until the sun came up. By the time I found my way back to the lake, I saw from the tree line that all of my camping gear was gone. It looked as if I was never even there. I stayed hidden and got back on the trail, making it back to my car. I made a report with the local police, but they never mentioned finding anything. I don't think they even really looked, to be honest. What was planned for me that night is horrifying to think about, but at least I got out before having to witness it firsthand. I was on a road trip from Portland to Chicago. It's nearly a 3-day drive, so I had some places booked to sleep at along the route. I didn't get too particular with what places I chose, but I went with Airbnbs to enjoy the road trip more rather than staying in crowded hotels. My first Airbnb was in Wyoming, and the route through the state doesn't pass through any big cities, so it was in a really small town, probably no bigger than 2 or 3 miles long. As I passed the border into Wyoming, it started snowing heavily, which only made the long day of driving feel even longer. By the time I got into town, the roads were covered in snow and the sun had already set. It was pretty dead. I don't know much about small towns, but this seemed exactly like I thought it would be, especially in a low population state like Wyoming. I was hoping there would be a McDonald's or something where I could get a quick dinner, but it was very clear that there wasn't going to be anything like that. So I drove through the town and turned down the road to my Airbnb. It was a long driveway leading up to a small home in the middle of a field with tall, snow-covered pine trees lined up in the front yard. I parked on the side, got out with my bag, and walked around to the front. I put in the code and got inside, closing the door behind me and turning on the lights. It was small, probably 500 square feet, with just a living room and a bedroom. I took my shoes off and dropped my bag next to the bed, then sat on the couch. When I did, I heard a thump coming from the bedroom. I looked back at the doorway I had just come through. It was pretty loud, but I had no idea what it could have been. I got up and walked back, looking into the room and turning on the light. It was all the same. I went and checked the small bathroom that was in there as well, but everything looked fine, and the only other door in the house was the bedroom closet. I walked over and tugged on the door handle, but it didn't budge. It seemed like it was locked from the other side. At first, I was pretty weirded out that a bedroom closet would be locked, but then I thought it could have been a maintenance closet that the owner was using to store stuff. There were no other places to put anything, so that was the final conclusion I came to. I went back to the living room and rested my eyes on the couch while thinking through my plan for the next day. After about 15 minutes, I got back up and went over to the window to see if the snow was still coming down and if the roads were even going to be drivable the next day. It was eerily dark outside, with no lights from the town showing behind the tall pine trees, and it was still snowing heavily. I shut the blinds and turned back to the couch, but I saw a shadow move in the bedroom. It was slow and smooth, like the shadow of a door opening or closing. I started walking over, listening as I approached the doorway, and looked inside the room. Everything was in place, and nothing looked like it could have caused the shadow I saw, but I knew I saw something move. I continued looking around until my eyes fell back on the closet. It was still closed, but something gave me an unsettling feeling about it. I stepped up and grabbed the handle, and this time it opened with ease. It wasn't locked anymore. Inside there wasn't anything. It was just a small, empty walk-in closet. Before I could fully process everything and try to put the pieces together, I heard someone behind me. When I turned around, a large man was standing in the doorway to the bathroom. He looked beaten and tired, with scratches and cuts all over his face. As I stared at him, he didn't even seem to care. He stepped into the bedroom and knelt down, grabbing a dirty and worn duffel bag from under the bed. The man then stood back up and didn't even look at me as he slowly walked out of the room and out the front door. I ran up to the window and saw him trailing through the snow until he was beyond the lights from the house. I tried to get the police involved, but after giving my description, they really only talked to the Airbnb host. After leaving town, I didn't get any more information. I think it's most likely that he was just using the place to sleep or something. But the way he looked makes me second guess that. I can't even think of what could have happened if I had gone straight to bed that night with the man hiding in the closet, just inches away from me. This was a few months ago while driving for DoorDash. I only drive as a side gig, maybe 10 to 15 hours a week. This particular night, I was only doing a couple of orders since it was already late, and I had picked up a small order around 1 a.m. It was to be delivered to a business building somewhere across town, which was apparent by the address. This was a normal thing, usually for overnight workers or something like that. When I pulled into the parking lot, though, it was empty, no cars at all, and it didn't look like there was a parking lot behind the building either. I parked in a spot near the front and got out with the food. The place was definitely an office building of some kind, but it was smaller than most, being only 2 stories and not very wide. All the lights were off in the windows, aside from one light behind the front door. I walked up to the door and checked the app, seeing that it had specific drop-off instructions to enter the main hallway and leave the bag outside of room 232. I looked through the door into the building, seeing a hallway with a bunch of closed doors on either side. Delivering to specific rooms was something I'd only done at hotels, so this was kind of new for me. I tested the door, pushing on it, and it was unlocked, so I stepped inside. I expected to hear people working, moving around, or talking, but instead, I didn't hear anything. There wasn't a single sound in the whole building. It was just white noise from the overhead lights buzzing above me. As I passed the first few doors, they were all numbered in the 100s, like 102 and 106. The room the instructions said to leave it at was in the 200s, so I assumed that meant it was on the 2nd floor. In the middle of the hallway was the doorway leading to the staircase. It was held open with a wedge door stopper on the floor, but the lights weren't on. I stepped into the stairwell and up to the bottom of the staircase, then looked up. The whole stairwell was pitch black. Not even any light was coming from above where the room was supposed to be. Again, I started to notice the eerie silence, and it sent a chill through me. I was always one to follow the instructions so I'd get good reviews, but this was the first time I told myself that this was too sketchy. I stepped out of the stairwell and back into the hallway, and just as I did, the door right across from me opened. The lights in that room were off, but a man emerged from behind the door and stepped into the hallway. He was wearing street clothes and didn't look like an office worker at all, but he stood in front of me and pointed past me at the stairwell. Room 232 is up there. I nodded but didn't move, and neither did he. He just looked me in the eyes with a look like he was suppressing his anger. After an intense few seconds, I dropped the bag on the ground and started quickly walking to the exit. The man didn't follow me, but I heard his footsteps go into the stairwell and up the stairs as I left the building. I got in my car and left. I didn't know what that was about, or if I was maybe overreacting, so I didn't call the police. The following day, though, the police actually called me. Apparently, the office reported a break-in, and in the CCTV footage, they saw my car and license plate tracking it back to me. They also had footage of the break-in, so they called me in to question me about any information I might have. I didn't have much to give, but it turned out there were actually 3 people that broke inside. One was downstairs, who I saw, but the other 2 were shown on the cameras to be hiding at the top of the stairs, seemingly waiting for me to go up. Disturbingly, Several other delivery orders were made to that same office that night, and all of the other drivers were smarter than I was. They left the orders outside by the front door. What would have taken place in that office had any of us gone up to the second floor is unknown, but hopefully the police can find the three men before anyone falls victim to it. Last winter, I took a trip to visit my uncle in a rural area in Idaho. He has a cabin out there where he's lived for a few years, and I hadn't had the chance to visit him until now. The idea of being out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by snow-covered forests, was quite appealing to me. My uncle is a bit of a loner, but he's always been kind-hearted, and he seemed genuinely happy when I told him I was planning to visit. The drive took me hours, and by the time I was close to the cabin, it was already dark. The GPS on my phone lost signal long ago, but my uncle had given me detailed directions, so I managed to make my way. The road twisted and turned, with towering trees on both sides, and the headlights barely illuminated the way. There was something eerie about the darkness. No streetlights, no sign of other cars, just the crunching of my tires over the snowy road. Finally, I saw the small mailbox that marked my uncle's property, and I turned down a narrow path that led deeper into the forest. I parked my car in front of the cabin, which was lit from the inside, warm light glowing through the windows. My uncle greeted me at the door, and we spent the next few hours catching up, enjoying some food and drinks. The cabin was cozy, with a fire crackling in the fireplace, and I began to feel at ease after the long drive. We talked until late into the night, and finally, I decided to call it a day. My uncle showed me to the guest room, which was on the opposite side of the cabin from his own room. It was small but comfortable, with a window that faced the dark forest beyond. I crawled into bed, pulling the blankets tightly around me as the wind howled outside. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why, but I had this uneasy feeling that something was wrong. The wind had died down, and everything was eerily quiet. I glanced at the window and froze. A shadowy figure was standing just outside, barely visible in the darkness. I could make out the silhouette of a head and shoulders, and it was facing directly toward me. My heart started pounding, and I felt my body go cold. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, but I knew I had to make sure. I slowly sat up and reached for the small lamp on the nightstand. I turned it on, and the light flooded the room, illuminating everything. I looked back at the window, but the figure was gone. All I could see was the empty, snow-covered forest. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that it was just my imagination or a trick of the light. I turned the lamp off and lay back down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I pulled the blankets over my head, trying to fall back asleep, but my heart wouldn't stop pounding. After what felt like an eternity, I heard something. Footsteps crunching in the snow, moving slowly around the cabin. They were faint, but unmistakable. I held my breath, listening as they circled the cabin, stopping every few steps. I felt a deep sense of dread, like whoever was out there was looking for a way inside. The footsteps continued, pacing back and forth, sometimes closer to the window, sometimes further away. I could feel the weight of the silence inside the room, only broken by those slow, deliberate steps outside. I considered waking my uncle, but feared making any sudden movements or sounds that might draw attention. Instead, I lay there frozen, straining to hear any more clues as to who or what was outside. Then, the footsteps stopped right outside my window. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I waited, barely breathing. The seconds stretched out painfully, and the quiet was deafening. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped right outside my window. I could hear heavy breathing, and I thought I could see the faint outline of a figure again. I was paralyzed with fear, unsure of what to do. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. I considered waking my uncle, but I didn't want to move, terrified of making any noise. After a few minutes, the footsteps started again, moving away from the cabin and fading into the distance. I lay there, trembling, until the first light of dawn began to filter through the window. Only then did I finally get up and go to my uncle's room. He was still asleep, and when I told him what had happened, he looked concerned, but tried to reassure me. He said that sometimes there were people who wandered through the forest, but they were mostly harmless. We went outside to check for footprints, and sure enough, there were tracks in the snow, circling the cabin and stopping right outside my window. My uncle looked at them for a long time, his face growing more serious. He said it was probably best if we left the area for the day, just to be safe. I didn't argue. We packed up some things and drove into town, spending the rest of the day there. We came back to the cabin that evening, and thankfully, nothing else happened for the rest of my stay. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and I left a day earlier than planned. My uncle still lives out there, but I haven't had the courage to go back since. Another time, I was driving late at night, heading back home after visiting some friends in a nearby city. It was around 2 a.m., and the highway was almost completely empty. The only lights were the occasional street lights and the headlights of my car cutting through the darkness. I was about halfway home, driving through a more remote stretch of road, surrounded by fields and forests. I had the radio on low, just to keep myself awake, and I was cruising along when I noticed something in my rearview mirror. A pair of headlights far behind me, gradually getting closer. I didn't think much of it at first, figuring it was just another car catching up to me. But as the headlights grew nearer, they suddenly swerved to the other lane, speeding up aggressively. My heart rate quickened as I watched the car accelerate. It was gaining on me fast, far faster than I'd anticipated. I thought they were just going to pass me, but when they pulled up beside me, they didn't. They kept pace with me for a moment, driving alongside my car in the other lane. I glanced over, but the windows were tinted too dark to see inside. The other car suddenly swerved closer to me, almost grazing my car. Panicking, I sped up, hoping to put some distance between us. But they followed, speeding up as well, staying right next to me. I had no idea what they wanted or what they were trying to do, but it was clear they weren't just trying to pass. My mind raced through all the possible scenarios, none of them good. I sped up even more, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the steering wheel. The car beside me kept pace for a few more moments before suddenly dropping back and falling behind. I thought maybe it was over, but then the car swerved back into my lane and sped up again, this time right on my tail. The headlights were blinding in my rearview mirror, and I could feel the car getting closer, tailgating me with no sign of stopping. I was terrified. There was nowhere to pull off the road, and no other cars around for miles. I pressed the gas pedal down, trying to go faster, but the car behind me matched every move I made. I didn't know what they wanted or why they were doing this, but I knew I had to get away. I scanned the road ahead for any sign of a turnoff or a gas station, anywhere I could go for help. Suddenly, the car behind me swerved again, this time pulling up beside me in the opposite lane once more. They jerked their car toward mine, forcing me to swerve to avoid a collision. My car fishtailed for a moment, but I managed to regain control just in time. That's when I saw it, a rest stop sign a few miles ahead. I gunned it, pushing my car as fast as it could go, hoping to reach the rest stop before the car beside me could make another move. As I sped toward the exit, the other car slowed down, staying behind me but keeping a steady distance now. When I reached the exit ramp, I swerved off the highway and into the rest stop parking lot. I pulled into a spot near the building, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced back at the highway, half expecting the car to follow me off the exit, but it didn't. I watched as the headlights disappeared into the distance, leaving me alone in the dark rest stop. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to catch my breath, before finally deciding to call the police. They told me they'd send a patrol car to check the area, but by the time they arrived, the other car was long gone. I never found out who was driving or what their intentions were that night, but I've never felt so vulnerable or terrified on the road. Ever since that night, I'm always cautious when I'm driving late at night, especially on empty highways. The car came right up alongside me, and I glanced over, trying to see who it was. The windows were tinted, and I couldn't see inside, but the driver stayed right beside me, matching my speed. I started to feel uneasy, unsure of what they were doing. I sped up, trying to put some distance between us, but they sped up as well, staying right next to me. I could feel my anxiety rising. I slowed down, hoping they would just pass me, but they slowed down too. It was clear that they were messing with me, and I had no idea why. I was out in the middle of nowhere, with no other cars in sight, and it felt like they were trying to intimidate me. I decided to try and lose them. I pressed down on the gas, accelerating as fast as I could. My car wasn't exactly built for speed, but it was enough to get ahead of them. I kept my eyes on the road, my heart pounding, hoping they would just give up. But after a few seconds, I saw their headlights again in my rearview mirror. They were gaining on me, and fast. Suddenly, they swerved into my lane, coming right up behind me, their headlights blinding me through my mirrors. I could barely see the road ahead, and I was terrified they were going to hit me. I kept my foot on the gas, my hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to stay calm. After a few minutes of this, they suddenly backed off, slowing down until their headlights were just small dots in the distance. I didn't dare slow down though. I kept going, my heart racing, until I finally saw an exit for a small town. I took the exit and drove into the town, pulling into a well-lit gas station. I watched the highway from the gas station, but the car never passed by. I waited there for a while, trying to calm down before finally getting back on the road. I made it home safely, but the whole experience left me shaken. I still have no idea who that was or why they were messing with me, but it felt like they were trying to scare me, and they definitely succeeded. I've always enjoyed going on solo hikes. There's something peaceful about being alone in nature, disconnected from the chaos of everyday life. I usually pick well-known trails that are frequented by other hikers, but one weekend, I decided to do something a bit different. I had read about an old, less-traveled trail in a remote part of the state, known for its natural beauty, but rarely visited because it was hard to get to and even harder to navigate. I set off early that Saturday morning, driving for several hours until I reached the trailhead. There were no other cars in the small dirt parking lot, which made sense since it was a trail that wasn't well known or well maintained. I was excited for the adventure and the solitude that awaited me. I packed my backpack, put on my hiking boots, and began my trek into the wilderness. The trail started off normal enough, winding through thick forests, the morning sun barely filtering through the dense canopy above. I could hear birds chirping and the occasional rustle of leaves as small animals moved through the underbrush. It was everything I wanted, a serene escape from reality. About an hour into the hike, the trail became more overgrown, with weeds and branches obstructing parts of the path, but I pushed on, feeling confident in my ability to find my way. After a few more hours of hiking, I reached a clearing. It was beautiful, the kind of place that made the difficult hike worth it. There was a small pond, and the afternoon sunlight sparkled across the water's surface. I decided to take a break there, sitting down on a large rock near the edge of the pond to eat my lunch. It was peaceful, and I felt completely alone in a good way. After my break, I decided to keep going a bit further before turning back. The trail continued on the other side of the clearing, leading back into the thick woods. As I walked, I noticed how quiet everything had become. The birds weren't chirping anymore, and the usual rustling of the forest had ceased. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to my imagination, but the eerie silence made me feel uneasy. I kept going, but after a while, I realized that I hadn't seen any trail markers for quite some time. I stopped looking around and realized that I might have wandered off the trail without noticing. Everything looked the same, trees in every direction with no clear path. My stomach sank, and I tried not to panic. I took out my phone to check my GPS, but there was no signal. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to backtrack or continue in hopes of finding the trail again. The thought of being lost in the middle of nowhere sent a wave of anxiety through me. I tried to stay calm and focused, reminding myself that I had plenty of daylight left and I had been in tougher situations before. I decided to head back the way I came, hoping to retrace my steps. But as I walked, nothing looked familiar. The trees, the rocks, everything blended together, making it hard to tell if I was heading in the right direction. My pace quickened as a sense of urgency crept in. Every time I thought I recognized the landmark, I realized I was mistaken. It felt like I was going in circles. After what felt like hours, I came across a small clearing again, but it wasn't the same one I had stopped at earlier. This one felt different, more foreboding. There was something off about it, like it was too still, too quiet. My gut told me to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I scanned the tree line, feeling as though someone or something was watching me. That's when I heard it, a soft crack of a branch breaking in the distance. My heart raced, and I froze, listening intently. Another faint sound, closer this time. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't alone. I decided to retrace my steps, turning back the way I thought I had come. I walked for what felt like a long time, but nothing looked familiar. The more I tried to find the trail, the more lost I felt. As the sun started to dip lower in the sky, I realized I needed to find a way out before it got dark. I kept walking, trying to find anything that looked like a trail, but the woods seemed to close in on me, the trees looking more and more unfamiliar. Then I heard something, footsteps. At first I felt a wave of relief, thinking maybe it was another hiker who could help me find my way back. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the forest fell silent again. I listened, waiting for a response, but there was nothing. I took a few steps forward, and then the footsteps started again, this time closer, but still out of sight. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Whoever or whatever was out there didn't want to be seen. I started walking faster, trying to put some distance between myself and the sound, but every time I quickened my pace, the footsteps followed, always staying just out of sight. I could hear twigs snapping and the crunch of leaves, and I knew that whoever it was, they were following me. Panic set in, and I began to run, not caring anymore about finding the trail. I just wanted to get away. The footsteps grew faster too, matching my pace. My heart was pounding, and I could barely catch my breath. I ran until I stumbled, falling to the ground and scraping my hands on the rough earth. I quickly picked myself up, my eyes darting around, trying to see who was following me, but there was no one, just trees in every direction. I forced myself to keep moving, my legs aching, until I finally saw something through the trees, a structure, maybe a cabin. I made my way toward it, hoping it was a ranger station or some kind of shelter. As I got closer, I realized it was an old, abandoned cabin, the wood weathered and the windows broken. It looked like it had been there for decades, untouched. I didn't have much of a choice, so I went inside, closing the door behind me. The interior was empty, with only a few broken pieces of furniture scattered around. I went to the window, peering out, but I didn't see anything. The forest was still, the sunlight now fading. I sat down in a corner, trying to collect my thoughts and figure out what to do next. Then I heard it again, footsteps, right outside the cabin. They were slow and deliberate, circling the building. I held my breath, my heart pounding so loudly that I was sure whoever was outside could hear it. I didn't dare move, afraid that any noise would give away my position. The footsteps continued, moving around to the side of the cabin, then to the back. I pressed myself deeper into the corner, every instinct telling me not to make a sound. The footsteps stopped directly outside the window, just inches from where I was hiding. I could feel the air around me grow colder as the fear gripped tighter. After a few moments of silence, I dared to peek out from behind the broken chair in front of me. Suddenly, the door rattled violently as if someone was testing it, trying to force their way inside. My heart nearly stopped, and I froze, listening to the sound of the door handle being twisted and yanked. It felt like an eternity before the rattling ceased, and the heavy footsteps moved again, this time fading slowly into the distance. I waited, barely breathing, for what felt like hours. Only when the forest was completely silent once more did I get up, cautiously peering through the cracks in the windows. Nothing moved outside. The woods seemed empty again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin forever. As much as the thought terrified me, I had to get out and find my way back before night fully set in. Grabbing my pack, I slipped out of the cabin as quietly as I could, praying that whatever had followed me was truly gone. With each step, I moved cautiously through the thickening dusk, hoping I wasn't walking toward danger rather than away from it. I waited, praying that they would go away, but instead, they stopped right outside the door. I heard the faint creak of the floorboards on the porch, and then the door handle slowly started to turn. I jumped up, looking for anything I could use to barricade the door, but there was nothing substantial enough. I ran to the far side of the cabin, hiding behind an old, overturned table. The door creaked open, and I heard someone step inside. They moved slowly, their footsteps echoing in the empty cabin. I tried to stay as quiet as possible, but I could see their shadow moving along the floor, getting closer to where I was hiding. My heart was pounding, and I knew I had to do something. I grabbed a piece of wood from the floor, ready to defend myself. But just as the shadow was about to reach me, I heard a loud noise from outside, a car horn. The person froze, then turned and quickly left the cabin. I stayed where I was, barely breathing, until I heard the footsteps fade away into the distance. I waited a few more minutes before getting up, my legs shaking. I cautiously made my way to the door, peering outside. The forest was quiet again, but in the distance, I could see headlights through the trees. I ran toward the lights, my body aching with exhaustion. As I got closer, I saw a car parked on a dirt road. A couple of hikers had stopped, honking the horn to get my attention. They saw me emerge from the woods, looking disheveled and panicked, and they asked if I needed help. I nodded, barely able to speak, and they let me into the car. I don't know who was following me in those woods, or what they wanted, but I know that if those hikers hadn't shown up when they did, I might not have made it out. I reported the incident to the local authorities, but they didn't find anyone when they searched the area. To this day, I can't explain what happened, and I haven't been on a solo hike since. The feeling of being watched, the sound of those footsteps, it still haunts me. A reminder that sometimes you're not as alone in the wilderness as you think. A few months ago, I decided to take a spontaneous road trip. I had a week off work, and I thought it would be fun to just drive with no set destination, see new places, and stay wherever looked interesting. I ended up in a small town in the Midwest, far away from any major highways, surrounded by fields and woods. The kind of place that seemed like it hadn't changed much in 50 years. It was charming in a way, like stepping back in time. I checked into a small motel on the edge of town, the kind with only a few rooms and an office manned by an older gentleman who looked like he'd been there for decades. The room itself was basic but clean, with old-fashioned floral wallpaper and a TV that still had rabbit ears. It was late afternoon, and I decided to take a walk around town before it got dark. There wasn't much to see, a few shops, a diner, and a gas station. It felt quiet, almost too quiet, like the whole place was holding its breath. As the sun set, I returned to the motel. I grabbed some snacks from the vending machine and settled into my room for the night. I was tired from driving all day, and after watching some static-filled TV, I decided to call it an early night. I locked the door, pulled the curtains closed, and turned off the light. I drifted off to sleep quickly, but sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why I'd woken up. The room was dark, and everything seemed still. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the grogginess, when I heard it, a faint sound like someone whispering. I held my breath, listening carefully, and it became clearer. The whispering was coming from right outside the window. It was low, almost like a chant, and I could hear multiple voices, all speaking in hushed tones. My heart started to race, and I slowly turned my head toward the window. The curtains were closed, but there was a small gap between them, and I could see shadows moving just beyond the glass. It looked like there were several people standing right outside my room. I was too afraid to move, afraid that they'd see the movement and know I was awake. I lay there, straining to hear what they were saying, but the words were indistinct. The whispering continued, and I could see the shadows shifting, moving back and forth. It felt like they were surrounding the room, and I felt a deep sense of dread. Who were they? What did they want? My mind was racing with possibilities, each one more sinister than the last. Then the doorknob started to rattle. Slowly at first, as if someone was testing to see if it was locked. I could hear the gentle clinking of metal as they tried to turn it, and I knew I had to do something. My phone was on the nightstand, and I reached for it as quietly as I could, my fingers trembling. I dialed 911, but before I could hit the call button, the rattling stopped. Everything went silent. The whispering, the movement, all of it just stopped at once. I held my breath, waiting, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't dare move. Minutes passed, and the silence stretched on, feeling heavy and oppressive. I finally mustered the courage to sit up and peek through the gap in the curtains, but there was nothing there. The parking lot was empty, just my car and a few others belonging to the other guests. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting on the bed with the lights on, my phone clutched in my hand. When morning finally came, I packed up my things as quickly as I could and went to check out. The old man at the front desk looked at me curiously, probably noticing my disheveled appearance, but I didn't say anything about what had happened. I just wanted to get out of there. As I drove out of town, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, like I was leaving something dark and unexplainable behind. To this day, I have no idea what those whispers were or who was outside my window that night. I try to convince myself it was just some prank, but deep down, I know it wasn't. The way they moved, the way everything just stopped at once, it felt wrong, like something far beyond a simple joke. It was as if I had stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to see, and I hope I never experience anything like it again. A few years ago, I used to work as a nighttime security guard for a small office building. It was an easy enough job. I'd sit in the office near the entrance, monitor the cameras, and do a few rounds through the building. There were only a handful of offices and a couple of conference rooms, and after 7 p.m., the place was usually empty. One night, it was around 2 a.m., and I was sitting at the desk half watching the cameras while reading a book. Everything was quiet, and I was just trying to pass the time until my shift ended. Suddenly, I noticed something on the camera feed, movement in one of the hallways on the second floor. It was subtle, just a shadow that seemed to move across the floor. I leaned forward, squinting at the screen, but the hallway was empty. I figured it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me, but to be safe, I decided to do a round through the building. I grabbed my flashlight and headed upstairs. The second floor was dimly lit, with only the emergency lights on, casting long shadows across the floor. I walked down the hallway, the same one I'd seen on the camera, but there was nothing there, no signs of anyone, and all the doors were closed. I continued down the hallway, shining my flashlight into each room as I passed. Everything seemed normal, and I was about to turn around and head back downstairs when I heard it, a faint clicking sound. It was rhythmic, almost like the sound of someone tapping their fingernails on a desk. It was coming from one of the offices at the end of the hallway. I walked toward the sound, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The door to the office was slightly ajar, and as I approached, the tapping stopped. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open, shining my light inside. The office was empty, just a desk, a chair, and a few filing cabinets. I stepped inside, looking around, but there was nothing out of place. Then the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam bouncing off the walls, but there was no one there. My heart was pounding, and I tried the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was like someone was holding it from the other side. I started banging on the door, calling out, but there was no response. The air in the room felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. After what felt like an eternity, the door suddenly swung open, almost as if it had never been stuck at all. I stumbled out into the hallway, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I looked around, but the hallway was empty, no sign of anyone. I didn't bother finishing my round. I went straight back downstairs, my heart still racing, and sat at the desk, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I checked the camera feed, rewinding to see if I could catch anything, but there was nothing. No movement, no shadows, nothing unusual at all. I stayed at the desk for the rest of my shift, refusing to go back upstairs. When my replacement finally came in the morning, I left without saying much. I ended up quitting that job a few weeks later. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired and stressed, but the feeling I had in that room, the weight in the air, the door refusing to open, it felt real. Too real. I haven't taken another security job since, and I still think about that night, wondering if it was something I imagined or if there was really someone or something there with me. About a year ago, I moved into an old rental house on the outskirts of town. It was a modest little place, set far back from the main road, with a gravel driveway and dense woods surrounding it. It had been empty for a while, and the landlord was eager to find someone to rent it out. The price was low, and since I had just started a new job nearby, it seemed like the perfect opportunity for a fresh start. The first couple of weeks in the house were uneventful. I spent my time unpacking, getting settled in, and enjoying the solitude. The nearest neighbors were a good distance away, and there was something comforting about the quietness of the area. But things started to change after the third week. One night, I was sitting in the living room, watching TV. It was around 10 p.m., and I had all the lights off except for a lamp in the corner. The house was quiet, and all I could hear was the low murmur of the TV. Out of nowhere, I heard a noise coming from the kitchen. It sounded like something had fallen off the counter. I figured it was just one of the dishes I hadn't put away properly, so I got up to check. When I stepped into the kitchen, I stopped in my tracks. The cabinet under the sink was wide open, and a small stack of plates that had been inside was now scattered across the floor. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to convince myself that maybe I had left the cabinet door ajar and it somehow fell open. I cleaned up the mess and made sure everything was securely shut before heading back to the living room. A few days later, I came home from work and immediately noticed that something was off. The front door was locked, just as I had left it. But as soon as I stepped inside, I had this overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone. I walked through the house, checking every room, but nothing was out of place. I told myself it was just my imagination and went about my evening. That night, as I lay in bed, I was jolted awake by a loud banging sound. It was coming from the living room, a rhythmic pounding that made my heart race. I threw off the covers and ran down the hallway, flipping on the lights as I went. The banging stopped as soon as I entered the living room, and I was greeted by silence. I looked around, confused and disoriented, until I noticed something. The front door was slightly open. I knew I had locked it before going to bed. I slowly approached the door, my heart in my throat, and peeked outside. The night was still, the yard bathed in moonlight, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I closed the door, locking it once again, and went back to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been trying to get inside. Things only got stranger from there. I started finding objects moved around the house, things I knew I hadn't touched. A chair in the kitchen would be pulled out from the table, or the bathroom mirror would be fogged up as if someone had taken a shower, even though I hadn't. One morning, I found muddy footprints leading from the back door to the middle of the living room, and then they just stopped, as if whoever, or whatever, had left them had simply vanished. The final straw came one night when I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep. The house was dark, and the only sound was the ticking of the old clock in the hallway. Suddenly, I heard a whisper, a low, raspy voice coming from somewhere in the room. My eyes flew open, and I looked around, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was empty, but the whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. It was like someone was standing right next to my bed, speaking words I couldn't understand. I bolted out of bed, grabbed my keys, and ran out of the house without looking back. I drove to a friend's place and spent the night there, too shaken to return. The next day, I called the landlord and told him I was moving out. He didn't seem surprised. He just sighed and told me that other tenants had done the same thing, leaving suddenly and without much explanation. I moved out that weekend, leaving behind the eerie little house and whatever was inside it. I never found out what was happening there, and I'm not sure I want to. I like to think it was just my imagination, that maybe I was stressed from work and overreacting, but deep down, I know it was something else, something that didn't want me there. Another time, I was staying at a friend's cabin up in the mountains. It was a beautiful place, surrounded by dense woods, with a view that stretched for miles. My friend Dave had invited me up for the weekend, and I was looking forward to a couple of days of hiking, fishing, and just relaxing away from the city. We spent the first day exploring the area, hiking through the trails, and enjoying the fresh mountain air. By evening, we were both exhausted, so we made dinner, had a couple of beers, and turned in early. The cabin had 2 bedrooms, so I had my own room, which was nice. It was cozy, with a small window that looked out into the forest. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. The cabin was completely dark, and for a moment I wasn't sure what had woken me up. I lay there, listening, and then I heard it. A soft tapping sound, like someone was gently knocking on the window. I turned my head, staring at the window, but it was too dark to see anything. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, and I felt my stomach drop. It was too high up for it to be an animal, and we were miles away from the nearest house. I sat up, my eyes fixed on the window, trying to see if there was someone or something out there. The tapping stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, the doorknob to my room slowly began to turn. I could hear the faint creak of the metal as it twisted, and I felt my blood run cold. I held my breath, my eyes locked on the door. It didn't open, but the doorknob kept turning back and forth, like someone was trying to get in. I finally found my voice and called out, "Dave, is that you?" The doorknob stopped moving, and there was a long moment of silence. Then, from the other side of the door, I heard a whisper. It was low, almost like a hiss, and I couldn't make out what it was saying. My heart was pounding, and I was too scared to move. After what felt like forever, the whispering stopped, and I heard footsteps moving away from the door, fading into the distance. I stayed in bed, too terrified to even reach for the light. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and as soon as the first light of dawn crept through the window, I got up and went to find Dave. He was in the kitchen, making coffee, and when I asked him if he had been up during the night, he just looked at me, confused. He said he'd been asleep the whole time. I told him what had happened, and he frowned, saying he'd never experienced anything like that before. We checked the cabin, but there was no sign of anyone else, no footprints, nothing. I stayed for the rest of the weekend, but I didn't sleep much, and I was relieved when it was time to leave. Dave still goes up to that cabin, and he says he's never heard or seen anything strange since then, but I can't shake the feeling that there was something there that night, something that wanted me to know it was watching. That experience has stayed with me, and I've never felt completely comfortable staying in isolated places since. It's one thing to enjoy the beauty of nature, but it's another to feel like you're not alone when you know you should be. A few months ago, I decided to rent a small cottage in a remote area for a week. I had been feeling overwhelmed with work and needed a break, a chance to disconnect and recharge. I found a quaint little place online that seemed perfect. Isolated, quiet, surrounded by nature. It sounded like exactly what I needed. The cottage was nestled deep in the woods, about 20 miles from the nearest town. It was charming, with old wooden floors and a stone fireplace. The first day I was there, I settled in, made some tea, and sat out on the porch, listening to the birds and the rustle of the leaves in the breeze. It was so peaceful, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could finally relax. The first couple of nights were uneventful. I spent my days reading, hiking in the woods, and enjoying the solitude. But on the third night, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside the cottage. It was around 2 a.m., and the sound was faint but distinct, like footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal, a deer or a raccoon. But the more I listened, the more it sounded like someone was walking around, slowly and deliberately. I got up and went to the window, carefully peeking out, but all I could see was darkness. The porch light was off, and the moon wasn't bright enough to illuminate much of the yard. The footsteps stopped, and for a few moments, everything was silent. I stood there, my heart pounding, straining my ears to hear anything else. Then, suddenly, there was a loud knock at the door. It was just one single knock, but it echoed through the silent cottage, and my heart felt like it stopped. I didn't know what to do. Who could possibly be out here in the middle of the night? I slowly crept to the front door, careful not to make any noise. I didn't want whoever was out there to know I was awake. I looked through the peephole, but it was too dark to see anything. I waited, holding my breath, hoping that whoever it was would just leave. After what felt like forever, I heard the footsteps again, this time moving away from the door. I stayed by the door for a while, listening, until I was sure that whoever it was had left. I eventually went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. Every noise, every creak of the old cottage made me jump. By morning, I was exhausted but relieved that nothing else had happened. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was probably just someone who got lost or maybe even a prank. I spent the day trying to enjoy myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. That night, I made sure all the doors and windows were locked, and I kept a flashlight by my bed just in case. Around 1 a.m., I woke up again. This time, it wasn't the sound of footsteps that woke me. It was the feeling that something was wrong. I opened my eyes and my heart sank. The front door, which I knew I had locked, was wide open. The cold night air was blowing in, and the darkness beyond the doorway seemed to stretch endlessly into the woods. I grabbed the flashlight and got out of bed, my hands trembling as I approached the door. I shone the light outside, but there was nothing, no sign of anyone. I quickly shut the door, locking it again, and checked all the windows. They were still locked, just as I had left them. I had no idea how the door had been opened. I barely slept for the rest of the night. I stayed on the couch, flashlight in hand, jumping at every noise. When morning finally came, I decided I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed up my things, loaded my car, and left. As I drove away from the cottage, I felt a sense of relief, like I was leaving something dark behind. I never found out who was at the door that night or how it had been opened. I told the owner about what had happened, and they seemed genuinely surprised, saying they'd never had any issues before. Maybe it was just someone wandering through the woods, but the way those footsteps moved, the way the door was wide open, it felt intentional, like someone wanted me to know they were there. I haven't been back to that cottage, and I don't think I ever will. Another time, a couple of years ago, I went camping with my friend Mark. We decided to go to a national forest that wasn't too far from where we lived. We both loved camping and had been to several places before, but this time we decided to venture a little deeper into the forest, away from the usual campsites. We found a spot by a small stream, miles away from the main road. It was perfect, secluded, peaceful, with only the sounds of the forest around us. We set up our tent, got a fire going, and spent the evening cooking, talking, and just enjoying being out in nature. As the sun went down, the forest around us grew darker, and the air turned cold. We stayed up for a while watching the stars before finally turning in for the night. It must have been around 3 a.m. when I woke up. I wasn't sure why I had woken up, but as I lay there, I realized I could hear something. Soft, almost rhythmic. It sounded like someone humming, a low, tuneless hum that seemed to drift through the forest. I thought I was imagining it at first, but as I listened, it became clearer. I turned to Mark, who was still asleep, and nudged him. He groggily opened his eyes, and I whispered, "Do you hear that?" He listened for a moment, then nodded, his eyes widening. The humming was getting louder, and it sounded like it was coming closer. It was the kind of humming you might hear from someone absent-mindedly singing to themselves, but it was unsettling in the dead of night, miles from anyone. We both sat up, trying to see out of the tent, but it was too dark to make out anything. The humming seemed to circle our campsite, moving slowly through the trees. Mark grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the light outside. There was nothing, just the empty forest. But the humming continued, drifting between the trees, always staying just out of sight. We sat there, flashlight in hand, listening as the humming slowly faded away until the forest was silent once again. We didn't say anything, just sat there, listening, waiting. Eventually, we crawled back into our sleeping bags, but we didn't sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, we packed up and left. Neither of us talked much about what we had heard, but I knew we were both thinking the same thing. Whoever or whatever had been humming had been watching us. It wasn't until we were back in the car, driving away, that Mark finally spoke. "Do you think it was just someone messing with us?" he asked, his voice uneasy. I didn't know how to answer. Maybe it was just someone playing a prank, but we were miles away from the nearest campsite, deep in the forest, where no one else should have been. The way the humming moved, always staying just out of sight, felt deliberate, like they were trying to let us know they were there without revealing themselves. It's been a long time since that camping trip, but I still think about it whenever I'm out in the woods. The forest, with all its beauty and tranquility, also holds an air of mystery. And sometimes, I think we forget how little we really know about what's out there, hidden in the darkness between the trees. I tried to put those nights behind me, focusing on work and spending time with friends, but that lingering sense of unease never fully left. The knocking incident haunted my thoughts, always making me question if something had followed me back from that decrepit hospital. For weeks, I avoided being alone at night, constantly inviting friends over or staying at their places, always searching for that feeling of safety I had lost. Then one cold, rainy evening, it happened again. I was home alone, cooking dinner, when I heard it, a soft tapping at the back door. My heart sank and my body froze. I turned slowly, staring at the door, hoping my ears were playing tricks on me. But the tapping came again, louder this time, deliberate. I could almost feel the urgency in each knock, like whatever was out there was tired of waiting. I knew I couldn't live in fear anymore. I couldn't let this shadow control my life. I grabbed a flashlight and took a deep breath, forcing my feet to move. I walked to the back door, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. I knew I had to confront whatever this was. It was the only way to take back control. I flung the door open, the cold night air hitting me instantly. There was nothing, just the dark yard, the rain pelting down, and the wind rustling the trees. My flashlight beam swept across the yard, illuminating the bushes, the fence, the empty street beyond. But there was no figure, no shape, no shadow. It was empty. I stood there, my heart pounding, my breathing heavy, and in that moment, something changed. The fear, the dread, the uncertainty, it all began to melt away. Whatever it was, I realized it thrived on my fear. It wanted me to be afraid, to be powerless. But I refused to give it that power anymore. I shut the door firmly, locked it, and turned off the flashlight. That night, I decided not to run, not to hide, and not to let the shadow control my life. I went to bed, the tapping still echoing faintly in my mind, but I knew I had faced it. And somehow, that brought me peace. The following days were uneventful. No knocking, no whispers, no sense of being watched. It was like whatever had followed me had finally given up, like it realized it no longer had a hold on me. The darkness that had once hung over me started to lift, and I began to feel like myself again. I still think about that abandoned hospital sometimes, about the shadow in the hallway, the whispers at my door. I'll never truly know what it was or why it chose to follow me. But I do know this. Sometimes the scariest thing we can do is confront the unknown, to face it head on rather than let it consume us. And when we do, the power it holds over us begins to fade. I haven't gone back to exploring abandoned places since, and I don't plan to. There's enough darkness in the world without going looking for it. But I know now that whatever I face, I have the strength to face it. And that's enough for me. If you enjoyed this story, please hit the like button, subscribe for more content, and share it with anyone who loves a good spooky tale. Let me know in the comments if you've ever faced your own fears and what gave you the strength to overcome them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.